Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this lesson on political behavior. My name is Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Let's start out with discussing the 6 types of participants in the voting age population, otherwise known as the VAP. You have first the inactives. These folks do nothing. They do not vote. They don't get involved in any political organizations or campaigns, and they don't talk about politics. They are generally uninformed about everything relating to government and politics. They have very little education. They're generally low income, and they're young, roughly about 22% of all participants. Now, voting specialists, on the other hand, they vote, but they don't really do anything else. They're very similar to the inactives, except they're older. They're exactly the same, except they vote, and they're older, all right? But generally speaking, they both know just about the same amount about politics. Those folks show up, but they don't really understand who they're voting for or why. Campaigners are folks who are, by contrast, very active. They vote, they get involved in campaign activities, they're very passionate about politics and their particular perspective or party. They generally have more education, they identify with a particular party, they take very strong positions. They almost enjoy the conflict that occurs between the various positions. Communalists are similar to campaigners in their knowledge and involvement, but they don't like the conflict. They'd rather save their energy for non-conflict based activities. So something that everybody can get behind, helping the homeless or helping veterans. It's what's called a nonpartisan issue. Both Democrats and Republicans support helping veterans and helping the homeless. But in different ways and to different extents. Parochial participants generally don't vote. They stay out of campaigns, but when they have a personal issue, they are going to be on the phone talking to their local officials or their representatives about their personal problem. Complete activists are the most active of everybody. They are highly educated, high income, and they participate in virtually every form of politics that is available. They are usually middle-aged. They're roughly 11% of all people. Now, let me give you a brief history of the vote before we get into voting proper. So, early 1800s, there were several requirements that were dropped. Religious requirements, property, and tax payment qualifications were slowly eliminated over the course of the 1800s or the 19th century. In 1870, we have the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted suffrage to black men. In 1920, women finally get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. In 1961, we have the 23rd Amendment that allowed citizens of Washington, D.C., otherwise known as the District of Columbia, to vote in presidential elections. In 1964, you have the 24th Amendment, which eliminated the poll tax. 1965, the Voting Rights Act guaranteed the right to vote for minorities because there were still the white establishment was still attempting to actively prevent minorities from voting. So this act allowed the federal government to step in and gave them some mechanisms for enforcing the right to vote for minorities. And finally, in 1971, the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age to 18. Yes, folks, it was not always 18. And I guess 1971 was a good time where they thought about it and scratched their heads and said, well, I guess it's kind of messed up that we can draft a kid or send him off to die at age 18, but then he's not allowed to vote in favor or against of the war he's going to possibly die in. So they thought that was not really the most fair thing in the world. So we formally changed the Constitution to allow people to vote at 18. All right. So we've talked about some basics here, but who really participates? Like, who are really the ones that show up on election day and are engaging in their civic duty, right? Education by far is the most important. It is the key defining factor that determines whether you vote or do not. More education equals more voting. Period. Religious involvement is also a good education. The folks who are particularly devout in their faith tend to have very strong opinions regarding social issues. And if they feel like showing up to vote is going to help them support those social issues, then they will participate. This was big for Reagan. The religious right came out to vote in droves for Ronald Reagan in the 80s. It was a big reason why he took the White House. Race and ethnicity also play a role. Whites tend to vote in higher numbers than minorities. This might be economic based to a degree, but it's pretty clear based on the percentages, exit polls, and the data that we've collected that whites vote in higher percentages than minorities do. Age is also a key factor. Young people, they just don't vote. They just don't like to get their butts to the polls. But 45 and up, they're always there. Gender also plays a role, although less so now. It is becoming more equal. Women, in some cases, are actually voting more than men, but it is equalizing. But previously, men voted more than women did. We have the two-party competition issue as well. More competitive elections have higher turnout. So elections where each side feels there is more at stake, more people will come out to the polls because they feel like they need to participate. Now, I want to draw your attention to this concept down here called cross-cutting cleavages. You have to understand that these are 6 factors. You can't just pick one and say, this is it. You have to look at all 6. You have to look at the variety of factors surrounding participation, because all of these 6 issues have play a role in when and why and how much people vote. So you have to think of it as solving for X. You have to control for the variables and recognize that correlation is not always causation. All right, so voting is studied in depth. Much more than any other form of political participation in the United States, much more than campaign donations, much more so than activity and volunteering for campaigns. Voting is studied significantly. So how do we study it? Well, we have the results of elections, we have the field of survey research, and we have studies of political socialization. All 3 of these items allow us to understand voters specifically and voting behavior in a much better way, so we can try to figure out how and why people vote the way they do or don't vote. Voting preferences can't be predicted by just one sociological factor. This is what I talked about in a previous slide. You have to look at all of these items in order to understand how and why people vote. Correlation is not causation. You have to make sure that you are properly evaluating each of these factors. All right, so some psychological factors we're going to talk about. Now, party identification versus candidates and issues. Certain people are extremely loyal to a party. I had my students do an experiment one day where I said, go home and ask your parents what party they are and start asking them questions about various issues that you can clearly define as Republican or Democrat, right? So one of my students goes home and she asks her mom, what party are you? She's like, I'm Republican. I'm like, okay, great. So what'd she say? You asked her the question, what'd you ask her? Well, I asked her if she was in favor of abortion, and she said she thought it was the women's choice. I asked her about gun control. She said there are too many bad weapons on the streets and that we should have more gun control. Asked her about gay marriage, and she thought that, whose business is it anyway if somebody wants to marry and who they want to marry. And I'm like, so what'd you tell her? And she said, well, Mom, I'm Republican. You say you're a Republican, but everything that you just described is Democratic Party platform. And she flipped out. She said, no, I'm a Republican. I'm going to die Republican. I've lived a Republican my whole life. My parents are Republican. I'm Republican. That's it. And this indicates very strong loyalty to that party. Now, let me point out that this is on both sides. There are plenty of people on the opposite end who are liberal simply because their parents are liberal, simply because that is how they've always identified, so that is how they will continue to identify. So party identification can be very significant in determining how people vote. On the opposite end, you have candidates and issues. Candidates and issues tend to be more short-term factors. As I talked about in a previous lesson, party identification seems to be a pretty stable aspect of public opinion, but candidates and issues fluctuate quite a bit. And there are some issues and candidates that are so important, some candidates that are so good or so bad that they will actually influence voters of opposite parties to vote or not vote for them. So that's important to take into account as well. All right, so here's a breakdown, a compare and contrast of voters and non-voters. All right, voters, as we've said before, tend to be higher income. They're very well educated. They have a high level for their occupation, professional level occupation. They're well established in a community, generally homeowners or urbanites, very strong party identification, and they have contact with that party. Now, this goes for both liberal and conservative. So don't generalize by thinking, well, Democrats tend to be well educated and Republicans don't. Not so. People who vote continually and consistently of both parties. This applies to both sides. They tend to live where laws and customs promote voting. They're generally older than 35, married, and they are established. They used to be generally considered male, but that is now shifting with the gender roles changing a bit. Non-voters tend to be lower income, very low education level, unskilled jobs. They're most often rural residents as opposed to urban or suburbanites. They have very little contact with party organizers, and they live where there's less enthusiastic enforcement of the right to vote. They tend to be younger, transient. They're in the process of becoming established. And again, traditionally, this category was with women, but that is changing. All right, there are three types of voters. Straight ticket, split ticket, and independent, and then there are two types of independent. Straight ticket, they vote the same party in all races all the time. It's always the one party, and that's it. Split ticket voters may split their ticket. They may vote Democratic for the president, and then they vote Republican for the congressional elections, or they'll split it up by federal government will go one party, and state and local government will go the other. Now, the two types of independents, we have independent leaners, people who are registered independent, but they do tend to vote for a political party, and pure independents, voters who have no consistent record. Nobody knows what the heck they're going to do until they press the button in a little ballot box. All right, non-voters. These people make me insane. So we have millions of people who do not vote when elections are held. Only 50.1% of eligible voters voted in the 2000 presidential election. Okay, let me refresh your memory on what happened in the 2000 presidential election. We didn't know who the president was for a while. It was that close. The Supreme Court had to step in and settle the deal. Now, I'm willing to bet that a good percentage of the 49.9% of people who didn't vote in 2000 really wished they had, because they really could have influenced the outcome of that election. Ladies and gentlemen, to quote The West Wing, decisions are made by those who show up. Do not complain if you don't get what you wanted when you did not participate. Decisions are made by those who show up. Now, let me give you a bit of some data about turnout in presidential elections. Here's my source. If you'd like to check out that site, you are welcome to it. Our highest percentage of voting turnout was in 1876 at 81.8. And so ever since then, it's been downhill from there. So I want you to kind of take a look at these statistics, and you notice that over the course of this about 30 years or so, we peaked in 1984 at 60.9, and we've been going down from there. My question is, what happened in 1984? That might be something to look up down the line. But this is, you want to kind of take a look at what these percentages are and start to think about what they could mean. This is a graph comparing turnout rates for presidential and midterm elections. Presidential election is in the solid black line, and then the broken black line represents the midterm elections. You can see the differences in VAP percentages. This is another graph. I invite you to pause and examine this. This is reported voting by race and ethnicity over a period of about 20 years. So feel free to pause and take a look at the graph and pick out some important data points that might enable you to understand more about voters. All right, so how do we explain some of these people's decisions? Like, why do people do what they do? So how do Americans see candidates? Candidate evaluations is one reason or one way to explain voter decisions. Candidates want a good visual image, especially on dimensions of integrity, reliability, and competence. Personality plays a role in vote choice, especially if a candidate is perceived to be incompetent or dishonest. Ladies and gentlemen, perception is 9/10 of the law. What is true is not necessarily true. It's what people perceive to be true, and candidates know this. Policy voting does occur, but not as much as one might think. This is when somebody bases their vote choice on issue preferences and where the candidates stand on specific policy issues, not necessarily party. Policy voting may occur if voters know where they and the candidates stand on issues and they see clear differences between the candidates. It's unlikely to occur because candidates are ambiguous on the issues, and the media tend to focus on the horse race, not on the issues themselves. They focus on the drama. And today, candidates are forced to take a clear stand in the party primaries, which increases chances for policy voting. That is the end of our little presentation. I hope this gave you a better understanding of political behavior, and I will see you in the next video.